So we will be spending today and next week in the book of Job, and then the plan is to do some topics in Proverbs throughout the summer, followed by a long study through Matthew that will start in the fall. And we've been in the book of Job for a couple months, and we're nearing the resolution point of this book. At this point, Job's life has been destroyed. He lost his kids, he lost his fortune, he lost his fame all in an instant, and he never learned why. His friends came along and they tried to convince him that to suffer that greatly, he must have sinned greatly. That God is just, they said, and therefore if God allows horrible suffering in your life, it's only because you've done something horrible, so fess up. Just come clean with what you've done wrong, and maybe then if you do, God will free you from all this. But Job hadn't sinned greatly. And he wasn't going to lie, he wasn't going to muster up some false apology, so he understandably complained about how broken things were. And he had two main areas of complaint. One is that the world that God made and the life that God made is not good. In Job 14:1, it says, "Man who is born of woman is few of days and full of trouble." He looked at his life, he says, you don't live that long to begin with, and the days that you get, they stink. So the world is hard, the world is broken, and my life is hard. And then on top of that, he said, therefore, God is not good. And that was his second big complaint. In Job chapter 10, verse 30, he's speaking to God. He says, does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? So he says, God, it's like you made me so you could despise me. And you show favoritism toward wicked people while the good are oppressed and suffer. And so that's how everything looks to Job. And Job's friends think that Job is his own worst enemy. Job thinks that God is his worst enemy. He never asks to get back all that he lost, but the one thing that's grieving him the whole time is that he doesn't have that relationship with God that he once knew. And so Job throughout this book wrestles, and he's not perfect. He says some things he regrets later, but he does keep clinging to God. He refuses to curse God and die. I mean, most of us would probably have walked away from God by this point, but Job won't do that. So he wrestles throughout this book. And after Job and his friends go round and round for what seems like forever, finally, at the end, God speaks into the chaos. And God gives some answers. And the answers that he gives are mysterious, they're unexpected, but they are good answers. And they're not answers that ever explain to Job all the reason for his suffering, and they're not answers that explain to us all the reasons for our suffering, but they are answers that prove that God has not abandoned us in our suffering. And so to answer that first complaint that the world God made isn't good, God takes Job on this verbal tour of the cosmos. He points out the goodness in creation. He shows how he still cares for creation. He shows that he's still involved in creation. God shows Job that he's not the chaos monster that Job thinks he is, but he's actually the architect and the designer of all of creation. And he demonstrates to Job that he understands the world far better than Job does. And so in response to that first speech, Job said in Job 40, verse 3, it says, Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further. So Job withdraws his complaint. And he pledges, I'll just be silent, I won't complain anymore. But God is gracious and kind. He's a God of how much more. He isn't just after a ceasefire with Job here. He's not trying to get partial peace or a false peace. God loves Job. And he's working to restore Job to that relationship with God that Job wants. And so God speaks again and gives a second speech. And it's like he's saying, you may have decided to be quiet, Job, but you still have these thoughts. You still have these doubts. You still think that I'm not good. So let me address those thoughts. And you see God being so kind, so willing to condescend, so willing to bridge the gap between himself and Job that Job could never bridge with his own reason or his own efforts. God comes down and speaks to him. And then God makes this second speech that we'll look at today. And just to show you where Job ends up after this speech, he's not just silent, but he actually gets the desire of his heart. In Job 42, verse 1, it says, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And so at the end of all this, Job is not silent, but he's speaking, and he's knowing he was heard, which is a big deal because back in chapter 9, verse 16, he said that God would never listen to him. So his view of God has changed. And now he says his eye sees God. It's like his fellowship with God is restored and probably even closer than it was before he lost everything. And at the end, when he says, I repent in dust and ashes, it could literally be translated, I'm comforted about the dust and the ashes. So at the end of it, he's finally comforted about all of the suffering that he went through. He's once again enchanted with God and close with God. And he's still in his ash heap, he is still in his suffering, but he's back with his God, and that's making all the difference in the world. And so what is it that God says in this second speech that makes all the difference? Because it can make a difference for us too in our quest to be re-enchanted with God. I mean, at first glance, it seems that God is just describing two more animals. I mean, he just described these 8 wild animals. In the first speech, Job decided to be quiet, and then God goes on to describe 2 more animals, and now Job's all better, which doesn't make sense. I mean, if Job is still on the outs with God, God shows him a hippo, and then Job says, my kids all died, but hippos are cool, so I guess I'm okay. Like, that doesn't seem like that's the conclusion that this book is driving after. There's got to be more to it than what it looks like at first glance in this speech. So what was it? What is it in the second speech that restored that vitality of Job's relationship with God, and what might be there for us too? Because there are some things that God says here that can change the way that we think about the world, that can change the way that we think about God, that can change the way we think about the evil and the chaos that we encounter in the world, and that can help re-enchant us with God as well. And not like as a magic bullet that solves all of our problems all at once, but as ingredients for our thoughts about God and his world that can help us persevere through hard times, can help us understand evil, and can help us continue to walk closely with God even when we suffer, even when we are sitting in our own ash heap. And so Job chapter 40, verse 6, here's God's second speech. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? So that's the big question that gets answered here. Is Job right to say that God has been wrong? Is Job right to say that God is unjust? And God basically gives a 3-part answer to that question. Starting in verse 9, he says, Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. And the point here is mainly overlap with some of the stuff we said last week, so we'll kind of fly over this point. But God is saying that one day he will judge and bring the proud low. He's saying that he has a strong arm, which is not just God flexing like a teenage boy walking through a mall mirror here. He's saying, like, I can do this. I actually have the power to judge. He's saying, I can see you all the way to the bottom. I know who's good. I know who's bad. I know where there's evil out there. I know where there's sin that needs to be punished. And not only do I know those things, but I have the full power to fully punish those things. In fact, he says that I can punish those sins in the afterlife, in the underworld, in verse 13. And so he says to Job, if you can do those things better than I can, then you can instruct me on how to do justice. I spend Sunday afternoons in the fall yelling at Josh Allen through my TV, telling him how to be a better quarterback, because I know. And so, with my bowl of Doritos, I'm yelling at him and instructing him. And imagine that one day Josh Allen was able to hear the things that I said and just looked into the camera, and he could say to me, are you able to leap over a defender, get pummeled into the turf, then stand up and do the whole thing again in 30 seconds? To which I would say, I get injured sleeping. And so really, I don't have the standing to be able to instruct Josh Allen on how to be a better quarterback. I can yell at him all I want, but really, I don't know. And what God's doing here with Job is he's saying, can you do this? Can you see someone all the way to the bottom? Are you strong to be able to judge? Can you judge them even in the underworld and the afterlife? Because as soon as you can, shoot me an email because I would love to get your advice. So he announces again his strength and his wisdom and his power over Job's. He's saying that God has the power to bring about true justice and he can be trusted to do so. And then he goes on, and in the second and third parts of his answer, he gives the description of these two more creatures. And these are creatures that are more mysterious than all the animals that he talked about in the previous chapter. These two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, in some ways defy definition a little bit. But what he says here is really healing for Job. And so in verse 15, he says, "Behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword, for the mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he's not frightened. He's confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare?" And there's not widespread agreement on what this creature Behemoth is. His name basically means the beast or the super beast, that he is a very big deal. It's a very strong animal, whatever it is. You could make the case that Behemoth was a hippo, that he was like some kind of super bovine, super beast that really existed. But also in many of the surrounding areas, he was worshipped as God. And a lot of mythology got attached to Behemoth in people's minds. And so, for example, the Egyptians would tell stories of their gods showing up as hippopotami and going to war against one another. So Behemoth was thought to be more than an ordinary animal, even with a supernatural element attached to it. And so the first thing God says about Behemoth is, I made him. I made him just like I made you. He's got strength, but he is not a god. He is part of the created order. And then in verse 19, it says that his maker brings near his sword for the slaughter. And so just like we might slaughter cows that are being ranched, God says, I'm kind of like the rancher to Behemoth, this beast that nobody could touch. God's not at all equaled by this beast, even though it seems like it's got some supernatural strength. God is its owner. And so this animal that's come to be thought of as a supernatural evil power is tamed by God. And so this beast that the nations fear as an evil power is like God's farm animal, not a big deal to God. And so Job had all these thoughts that the supernatural evil in the world was far too bad. It was far worse than could ever be conceived of. It was all untamable. There was nothing we could do about it. God says, that's not true. I'm Behemoth's owner. So God has not lost control even over supernatural evil. And now we'll focus more on the next creature, which is Leviathan. Job 41, verse 1, he says, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook?" So Leviathan is a sea creature. And in the minds of people in that day, the sea was the symbol of unpredictable chaos. And storms would come up quickly on the sea. They didn't have a weather app. They didn't know it was coming. So they would go out on a boat, and storms would come seemingly out of nowhere, and they were totally defenseless against it. Huge waves would rise up, they'd crash against their boats, none of it could be predicted, and then what was under the water was an even bigger mystery. We have underwater cameras and submarines today, and we know a lot more than they did about what was under the water, but even still, the ocean is so vast and so deep, and there's so much mystery and so much scary stuff down there associated with it, that we could understand thinking of the ocean as the place of just utter mystery and chaos. I love going to the ocean, like being at the ocean and sitting either at the mountains or on the ocean reading a book is like one of the most refreshing things that can happen in my life. I love it there, I love walking along the ocean. Being along the side of it is awesome, but not so much going in it. Like, Debbie likes to swim in the ocean, and I don't, because there's so much stuff in there that wants to kill you, and you can't see it. Like, you don't know what's out there. And so there was one day, a couple years ago, we were at the ocean, and Debbie went out into the ocean, recklessly swimming, and I was sitting on the shore with my book, and she had one of the kids with her, and one of the kids started crying. And so I run out, and turns out there was like a school of jellyfish that had come along and stung one of their legs, and it wasn't too bad, but obviously still scary. And so I did my job as a father and did like the comforting thing. But in my head, I'm going, I told you, like, this is what the ocean is like. Like, there's stuff in there and you can't see it, and it wants to hurt you. And so the ocean is a good and apt symbol of chaos. And then God looks at Leviathan and says, within the chaotic, powerful sea, there's another real creature that came to be thought of in supernatural terms, the Leviathan. And it was a chaotic, untamable, serpent-like super creature within the chaotic, untamable sea. And because Leviathan lived in the water, it was even more mysterious to people. They only saw parts of it. So as parts of it would come up above the water, their imaginations would run wild. They didn't know what the rest of it even looked like. And so if you Google pictures of Leviathan, there's actually a pretty wide range. And the range goes from like crocodiles, which some people think this Leviathan was, but I don't think so, up to like these supernatural, like dragon-looking creatures. And it seems to me that there is no creature that we don't think of as extinct that fits this description today. So I'm not sure what it was, but it seems like it was some kind of untamable sea serpent dragon type creature. And maybe that's even where a lot of the dragon myths from a lot of cultures all came from, because there was something like that in the sea that they saw. And so people from all over the ancient Near East, they started to fear Leviathan. They feared that dragon that ruled the chaotic sea. And God introduces him by saying, I'd go fishing for that. That supernatural power that you fear, that seems to be so strong in your life, I'm pulling it in with a fish hook. Then he goes on, verse 3, he says, will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? It's like that Leviathan that you fear, to me, it behaves like a puppy. Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who is given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So God describes this serpent a little bit, and he says that he has power even over the most powerful, supernatural evil that there is. That God has power over this serpent monster in the chaotic sea. And then he goes on to describe Leviathan in vivid detail. And this is detail that Job wouldn't have known. Job knew about Leviathan, but he could never come up with all the detail because he couldn't see under the water. He couldn't see all the parts of it. But nothing is obscured to God. God can see it. The waves don't stop him from seeing what's going on. And so in verse 12, he says, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his goodly frame. Who can strip off his outer garment? Who would come near him with a bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth is terror. His back is made of rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of the fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The folds of his flesh stick together, firmly cast on him and immovable. His heart is hard as a stone, hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. At the crashing, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He counts iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. For him, sling stones are turned to stubble. Clubs are counted as stubble. He laughs at the rattle of javelins. That's why I don't think he meets the description of a crocodile. Like, weapons cannot stop this thing. His underparts are like chopped potsherds. He spreads himself like a threshing sledge on the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him, he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. On earth, there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. So God describes this sea monster, and he emphasizes his strength and his power and his unstoppability. And in many ways, Leviathan mimics God. Leviathan seems unstoppable, impenetrable, invincible, omnipotent. In fact, listen to verses 18 to 21 again. He says, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes from his mouth. Okay, now listen to this description of God in Psalm 18, verse 7. It says, the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. So notice how Leviathan, big evil, mimics God. And this is big because the suffering that we go through can seem like that. We go through trials, we have sins in our lives, or we brush up against evil around us in the world, and it can seem eternal. Like, we can convince ourselves this will never end. We almost take that attribute of God, eternality, and we ascribe it to the trials that we're going through. This will last forever. Our trials mimic God. Our trials and the problems we run into, evil and chaos in the world, can seem like they're totally omnipotent. Like, they have power, we think, and you could never stop them. I'm powerless in this situation. Evil can seem omniscient, where I just keep getting outwitted by evil people and manipulators. Satan masquerades as an angel of light. Satan takes on some false versions of the attributes of God, and he convinces us that the power of evil is all-powerful. So Leviathan mimics God and convinces people that he is God, but God has no equal. And in this passage, God's playing with Leviathan like a pet bird. People can't hunt Leviathan, but God is filling his back with his harpoons. And God, in almost gleeful terms, is describing Leviathan like a hunter might describe the strength and the speed and the power of his prey. So God describes how under control he is with joy. Not joy in evil, but joy in his control over evil. And then right there, that description of Leviathan ends, and so does God's speech. And then right from there, Job goes and he worships, which is weird because God never makes any points. Like, I went to college for preaching sermons, and you're supposed to have points. Like, you're supposed to have therefore, and then A, B, C, D. Like, you're supposed to have some applications to those things. There's no application here. God describes Leviathan's power. He describes his superior power. That's the end of the speech, and that restores Job's soul. So what is it about what he says there that restores Job and could restore us? Well, part of it is that God is pointing Job to the real enemy in the world. Remember, Job's friends came along and they said Job was the enemy. Job said God was the enemy. And so it's like God takes him down to the seashore and he says, look out there at the powerful serpent. That's the enemy. God heard everything that Job said. And back in Job chapter 6, verse 4, Job said, for the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. And by pointing Job to Leviathan, God's saying, you're not my target, Job. Leviathan is, Satan is. He's the one I'm shooting my arrows at. He's my real enemy. He's your real enemy. I'm not the chaos monster. He is. You're not my prey. He is. and there's no risk of me losing this battle, but I am at war with him on your behalf. And Job, you couldn't see that that's what was going on, but that is what's going on. Job, you got me all wrong. The enemy is not me. The enemy is Satan. The chaos monster is not me. The chaos monster is Satan, and I've got this. And it's important for us to think this way. In our lives, we know that God is sovereign over everything. He's the king over everything. He has control over everything. But let's not start for a second to think that God is the author of evil. He has it under his control. He has set boundaries for it and limited it. But he didn't make evil, and evil, as strong as it is no match for God. It's allowed to do what it does for now, for whatever reasons God has for allowing it, but God didn't make evil. He's not evil. He's in a very calculated and intentional war against evil on our behalf, and at just the right moment, he'll end it. And we're not his target. Even though sometimes the suffering we go through can make us feel like I must be, he's shooting his arrows into me. He's shooting his arrows into Leviathan. And because he's God, he'll win right when he wants to. He's not overwhelmed by evil, but also God is not the evil one. He isn't the enemy, and Job isn't the ultimate enemy here either. And isn't this so important for us? Because so often we go through life and encounter so much evil in so many people and in so many places in society, and we can get so locked into battles with one another, even within the church. We can get locked into battles with our spouses, with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and we treat them like they're the ultimate enemy. Sometimes God has to say, remember Leviathan. Or Ephesians 6:12, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And there are times when we're locked into battle that we just have to back away and say, we're not our enemies here. There's a real war. There's a real satanic enemy who seems so strong and it just keeps coming, but we're not the enemies of one another. So by pointing to Leviathan, God's reminding Job of who the real enemy is. Also, God gives this long description of Leviathan to Job, which shows that God knows evil better than we do. I mean, Job knew some things about Leviathan, but it was all murky. It was obscured by the waves, but nothing was obscured to God. And he describes this creature that comes to represent satanic evil in all kinds of detail. And there aren't a lot of descriptions like this in the Bible. I mean, you read the beginning of Genesis and God describes him creating the animals, but he doesn't describe the animals. You don't see a lot of physical descriptions of a lot of people. We don't know what Jesus looked like. We'll have quick descriptions like Rachel was beautiful, and then he just kind of moves on, doesn't get into detail about that. But here he gives this long and vivid description of the sea dragon that symbolized evil. So by doing so, God is saying, I know far more about evil than you do. And God doesn't downplay it. So as Job thinks, how could God be good when there's so much evil in the world? God says, evil's actually stronger than you think. It's worse than you think. And I know about every clasp on every scale on its back. I know its strength. I know its power. And so Job, if you're thinking, how could God be good? I now understand evil, so I can't believe he's good. God says, don't I understand it better than you do? I know what evil is like. I'm telling you, I'm good and you can't put me in the wrong. And sometimes when we encounter evil in people or evil in the world, we can have some pretty strong reactions to it. We have to warn people when they come onto our staff often, like that you are going to be seeing people at some of their worst moments. You're going to encounter some of the worst evil you've ever seen in human hearts. You're going to be shocked at some of what you see. Because there can really be two different responses to that. One is when we start to see so much evil and so much darkness, it could be easy for us to start to become malevolent ourselves or to become bitter against a God who would allow this in his creation. Or we could become all the more appreciative of God's final defeat of evil that's coming. And we really need to be the latter. We need to understand that evil is real and it's far worse than we know, and God will defeat it. And that will be good. He's got even that under control. Also, as you read through these speeches, you see that God has a joyful tone as he describes his world, and a joyful tone even as he describes his rule over Leviathan. And so it seems like that joyful, jovial, upbeat tone that God has here shows us his fearlessness, it shows us his peace, and it shows us his mastery over everything that we're afraid of. So God knows evil better than we do, fully acknowledges that it's worse than we think it is, and he still speaks with joy about the direction of history. He still speaks with joy in his creation. This is something else that Job got wrong. In Job chapter 3, when Job first starts complaining, he looks at the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of his life, and Job says, this whole thing is bad. Burn the whole thing down. Shut off the lights. This is no good. But God, who knows evil better than Job does, right down to every scale on its back, is not at all pessimistic. Because nothing is more sure than the defeat of Leviathan at the hands of the skilled and divine hunter. In fact, this is the promise that's made all throughout the Bible. Remember, that serpent came into the garden at the beginning and deceived Adam and Eve. And they ate from that fruit. Evil was brought into creation. And then God comes to hand out the curse, to hand out the punishment. And to the serpent, he says in Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So at the very beginning, on like page 3 of the Bible, God is promising that the offspring of Eve one day will come and crush the head of the serpent. It's guaranteed from the very beginning. You go to Isaiah chapter 26, and the nation of Israel is praying, and they're lamenting the fact that they didn't change the world like they wanted to. They say in Isaiah 26:18, we were pregnant, we writhed, but we've given birth to wind. We've accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. I don't know if you ever feel like that. Our family didn't accomplish our mission to be different, to be a light. Our ministry didn't work. Our church didn't change the world. So they're lamenting this fact. But then they start speaking with some hope. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. God speaks, come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself for a little while until the fury has passed by. For behold, the Lord is coming out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, and the earth will disclose the blood shed on it and will no more cover its slain. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that's in the sea. Now, this is not some promise that God's going to come and kill the crocodiles. This is a promise that God is going to defeat evil, that he will fully and finally conquer every last bit of it. That fleeing serpent that you couldn't conquer yourself, God will come and conquer it. Then you go to the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 20, verse 1, and he says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. And you go down to verse 10, and it says, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And that's the end of the story of Leviathan. That Leviathan is real, and the evil he represents is real, and Satan and sin and death are real. And God, with total peace and confidence, is hunting that serpent, and at just the right time will fully and finally slay him. Therefore, God is joyful, even though there is great evil in the world. He doesn't deny the existence of evil. And so if you are waking up these days to a world filled with Leviathan, you can take joy in the power and the skill and the knowledge and the wisdom of the hunter. Evil is worse than we know, but the one who knows it far better than we know it is joyful. So we can look to him for our reaction to things. When our kids were little, if they would fall down, often they would immediately look up to us to see how they should react. So they'd crash into the kitchen floor, they would look up to us, and if we panicked, they'd panic. Like if we wanted to make them cry, then show a panicked look, get all breathless, run up to them, and they'll cry. This will be a big deal. But if they fall down and we immediately say, "You're okay," then more times than not, they would get up and say, "I'm okay." They looked to us for how they should react to all of that. And so here we are, crashing into evil in this world. We're in this world with devils filled that threatens to undo us. We look around, we see evil and loss and grief and sin and fear and uncertainty and sickness. We see broken government and broken families and broken churches and hopeless situations. We've crashed into the reality of evil and suffering, and we look up at our Father, and he's not at all panicked. He's smiling, not calling evil okay, but looking at us and saying, "You're okay. I've got this." That evil's more deadly than we feared, but still we have God enjoying the goodness of his creation without being anxious or troubled at all. And so we can look to our Father to gauge what our reaction to all this should be. I mean, if God is joyful, and he is, then can't we be too? Even though we often mourn and weep and cry and suffer, all those things are real. If God is completely confident in his defeat of evil, can't we then rest, knowing that the defeat of evil is a sure thing? I mean, we wake up to panic all around us. You wake up to panicked kids, panicked employees, panicked news media, but you look at your Father, and with a smile, he says, "I've got this." Man, if I believed that like I should, what would that do to me? I'd be far less anxious. I'd be far less prone to making decisions out of fear. My attitudes would be different. My pattern of frenzied overwork would change. My fear that maybe this is the time that finally evil will triumph and evil circumstances will overwhelm me and win, that would all diminish. If I could look to this Father who knows evil better than I do, but is reeling it in with a smile on his face, then my reaction would be a lot different too. In the book of Proverbs, when it describes Lady Wisdom and it talks about how she looks at the future, it says, "Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." This is a Christian response to evil. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. We don't pretend that it's not bad. We don't ignore any temptations toward remorse or pain. We experience those things, and we look to our Father who says, "You're okay. I got this." And if God can look at his world and see all the worst parts of it, but still call the world good and rejoice in it, then as we look to him for how we should react, couldn't that become our perspective? And wouldn't this change the way we interact with people? Wouldn't we take a lot more joy in people if we didn't have to deny the evil that's in them because that's there, but also we saw them as made in God's image and worthy of dignity and respect? We could enjoy them, we could be fascinated by them, we could befriend them without feeling the need to ever endorse sinful behaviors or deny that there's sin, but also to believe that they are made in God's image and there's beauty there and there's something to be fascinated with there. And Leviathan is real, and he's real in a good and beautiful world. And evil is real in people who are wonderfully made in God's image. If we could think this way, couldn't we take a lot more joy in our spouses, our kids, our church, all of our lives? If we never had to deny that wrong exists, we know it's there, but also we shared God's jovial and peaceful attitude toward the world that he made. God takes joy in his creation, even though he knows that for a time, evil and chaos dwell there. So could we take joy in our families and people and our spouses and our kids and our church, knowing full well that these things are far from perfect? And then as you follow the storyline of the Bible forward, we get to the cross of Jesus. And there you have it. That's where the head of the serpent is crushed by the bruised heel of the Savior. And God certainly doesn't deny evil's badness. On the cross, we can see that evil in us was so bad that the Son of God had to go and be crushed for it. But also God shows his total control because Jesus rose from the dead. And that's how sure that final defeat of evil is. Evil is not all powerful. Jesus crushed its head. And overcoming physical Leviathan is nothing compared to overcoming death, but Jesus burst out of that grave like it was nothing. I mean, who is he that can stand before him? And so as much as you might be suffering, and your suffering is very real, you're not his ultimate target. God has bigger fish to fry. And he's at work in his world for our good, and he went to work on the cross for our good because evil is real and we needed to be rescued from it, but he's totally good and totally in control and had within himself to give the life of his son to rescue us, and he gladly did so. And he welcomes us into his gladness. And so in a moment here, we'll be taking the Lord's Supper together, and this is where we're reminded of the gospel. And it's the message that, yeah, I've sinned and I should have died for my sin. My evil is that bad. I'm that corrupted. Evil's not just out there. It's not just in other people. It's not just in society. It's in me. But in the great exchange, Jesus came to slay that Leviathan. He took our sin on himself. He went to the cross where he died in our place. And 3 days later, he burst out and defeated the grave. And the way that we receive that gift is through faith. It's by turning from our sin, turning from our unbelief, and then turning to him in faith. And the Lord's Supper reminds us of his body that was torn and his blood was spilled so that we could be redeemed. Every time we take this supper, we're preaching to ourselves again that I am far more evil than I ever would have known. But God loves me more than I could ever dream. And what he accomplished on the cross, I'm more forgiven and redeemed and promised a far better future than I could ever dream of. And so if you're someone who has received that, if you are a Christian who's believed in that Jesus accomplished that victory over sin on the cross, that he rose again, and you've repented of your sins and trusted in him and him alone for your Savior, and you've also confessed all of your known sins, you're not clinging to anything and holding on to some behavior that God calls wrong, then we would encourage you to take this supper with us to celebrate again the fact that Jesus' body was torn and his blood was spilled so that evil could be conquered and so that we could be with him. And if you're here and you're not a Christian, we take the Lord's Supper as a way of saying that I am a Christian. It's a symbol of the faith that we're professing to believe. And so we would encourage you not to say with your body what's not true with your life and what's not true with your heart. The Lord's Supper is not for those who haven't yet believed, because in taking it, we're saying we believe. But we also want you to stick around and keep asking questions and spend time with our church and with one another. Don't feel at all pushed out by this. But we take this symbol as Christians to say, I believe these things.